The dinner was Frank Calloway's idea. He'd reserved the entire private dining room at Garrison Steakhouse, the kind of place where the menus had no prices and the waitstaff refilled your water before you noticed it was low. 30 guests. White tablecloths. Candles that cost more than my weekly grocery bill. I sat near the middle of the long table in the black dress I'd worn to 3 different client presentations that year, the one I kept because it still looked new. I had just spent 11 months saving my father's company. The Meridian Commons project, a 12-acre mixed-use development on the east side of Austin, had been dead in the water when the original architect walked out. Frank handed it to me with 6 weeks left on the deadline and zero apology for the state it was in. I rebuilt the entire site plan from scratch. I worked weekends. I skipped my own birthday. I presented to the city council alone, without a single member of the leadership team in the room, and I got the approval. The project was now Callaway Design Group's largest contract in 14 years. That night at Garrison's, Frank stood up at the head of the table, tapped his wine glass, and smiled the way he always did when he was about to say something he'd rehearsed. "I want to propose a toast," he said, "to the future of Callaway Design Group." He turned and looked directly at my brother Trent. "And to the man who is going to lead it there." Trent stood up like he'd been expecting it, which he had. He was 28 years old. He had a business degree from a school he'd transferred to twice and a handshake that he practiced in mirrors. He'd been at the firm for 14 months. In that time, he had attended client meetings, ordered lunch for the team, and taken a golf trip to Scottsdale on the company card that Frank called a networking retreat. Trent smiled around the table with that easy confidence that came from never once being told no by anyone who mattered. Effective the 1st of next month, Frank announced, Trent will be named Chief Executive Officer of Callaway Design Group. He'll also receive a majority equity stake, 31% of the company's shares, to be transferred directly from my holdings. The table applauded. Frank's business partner Dale raised his glass. Trent's college friend Marcus, who somehow always ended up at these dinners, hooped from the far end. My mother died and touched my arm briefly, like a period at the end of a sentence she hadn't actually written. I looked at my plate. The steak in front of me had cost $64. I knew, because I had helped Frank's assistant Karen arrange the reservation, the menu, and the floral order that morning while simultaneously finalizing the last engineering revision on the Meridian Commons drainage plan. No one had toasted the Meridian Commons project. No one had said my name. I waited. I told myself maybe it was coming. Maybe Frank was building to it, saving the real moment for after Trent's applause died down. I had done this before, the quiet waiting, the reasonable benefit of the doubt. I was good at it by now. I'd had 31 years of practice. Frank sat back down. He cut into his steak. Conversations broke out across the table. The moment passed the way those moments always did in our family, smoothly, cleanly, without a seam. My brother leaned over to me from 2 seats away. "Big night, right?" His tone was generous, the way people are generous when they've already won. I nodded. "Trent," I said carefully, "the Meridian project, the one that just brought in the Hargrove contract, the one that kept the firm solvent this quarter." He blinked. "Yeah, that was a big one. Do you know who ran it?" He tilted his head slightly. "You helped, right?" Something happened in my chest. Not an explosion. More like a door closing very quietly. "I helped," I repeated. He nodded and turned back to Marcus. I set down my fork. I picked up my water glass and held it for a moment. Then I did the thing I had taught myself to do in rooms like this one. I breathed. I calculated. I said nothing that could be used against me later. And somewhere in the back of my mind, behind the anger and the exhaustion, I heard my grandmother Ruth's voice from 6 months ago. Be patient, Maya. Timing is everything. Hold your cards. Frank gave his second toast of the evening just before dessert. He talked about legacy, about what it meant to build something that outlasted you. He looked at Trent when he said these things. He had built Callaway Design Group in 1987, he said. He had sacrificed for it, fought for it, and now he was passing it on to family. I almost said it then. I almost stood up and said the thing that had been sitting in my chest since 6 months ago when Ruth showed me the documents in her fireproof lockbox. But I didn't. Because Walter Osei had told me not to. Not yet, he'd said, sitting across from me in his quiet office on West 6th, his reading glasses on, his voice steady and precise. You act before the estate is ready, and you give them time to maneuver. You wait until the trigger moment. We choose the moment. So I sat there while my father talked about legacy, and I thought about Ruth Callaway, who had actually built this firm. She had started it in a converted garage on Runberg Lane with a drafting table, a used copier, and a contract to redesign 3 city park spaces for $4,200. She had grown it from that into a 14-person firm with a regional reputation before she ever handed Frank the keys. Frank talked about himself the way people did when they'd inherited something and convinced themselves they'd built it. I drank my water. I kept my face perfectly still. I was very good at keeping my face still. It was my mother who finally handed Frank the moment he used to humiliate me. Diane Callaway had a talent for it that I didn't think was intentional, which almost made it worse. She meant well in the small, shallow way that people meant well when they weren't paying real attention. She touched Frank's arm and said, loud enough for the nearby guests to hear, "Frank, what about Maya's role going forward?" She said it the way you asked about a neighbor's fence, something adjacent, not quite central. Frank looked at me then for the first time all evening. His expression was patient, practiced, the expression of a man who had explained something before and expected to explain it again. Maya is a valued member of our team, he said. She'll continue contributing in her current capacity. I looked at him. My current capacity, I said, is what? Frank set his wine glass down. You're a project coordinator, Maya. An important one. I'm a licensed landscape architect with 8 years of production experience, I said. I run projects. I ran Meridian. He smiled. Tightly. Let's not make tonight about titles. I kept my voice even. I'm just asking what my role will be once Trent takes over. Frank looked at me the way adults looked at children who asked questions at the wrong time. You just work here, Maya, he said. He said it lightly. Like a fact. Like the weather. 30 people heard it. The table went quiet. My mother looked at her dessert menu. Trent studied his water glass. And I folded my napkin, set it beside my plate, and made a decision. I drove home that night on the 183 with the radio off. Austin glittered to my left, all glass towers and highway light. I had grown up in this city. I knew its parks, its creek corridors, its floodplains and soil types. I had spent 8 years shaping the way pieces of it looked and felt and functioned. I did not cry in the car. I had done my crying already in smaller doses over smaller slights, across many years. I was past that now. I was in a different kind of place. When I got home, I made tea and sat at my kitchen table and opened the folder I kept in the bottom drawer of my filing cabinet. It was a manila folder, nothing special, labeled in pencil in Ruth's handwriting. It held 4 pages. A letter from Ruth to me, dated 18 months ago. A 1-page summary prepared by Walter Osei, attorney at law. a copy of a share registry from Callaway Design Group's original 1987 incorporation documents, and a note in Ruth's hand that said simply, "You were always the one who understood what this was." I had read these pages many times since Ruth first gave them to me. I read them again now. Ruth had never transferred her founding shares to Frank. She had signed over operational control, the title, the authority to run the firm day to day. But the equity, 52% of the original founding shares, had remained in her name inside a family trust she set up in 2019. Her will directed those shares entirely to me. Frank did not know the trust existed. I had met Walter Osei for the first time 6 months ago on a Thursday afternoon in February. Ruth had called me that morning and said, "Come to my house for lunch. Just you. Bring nothing." Ruth lived in a small ranch house in Buda, 20 minutes south of Austin, full of books and African violets and the smell of cedar. She had retired from any active role at the firm 7 years earlier, but she still got the quarterly reports, and she still read every line of them. She made chicken salad, and we sat at her kitchen table, and she watched me eat for a while before she said anything. "How are you really?" I told her the truth, which I didn't always do. I told her about the Meridian Project, about doing the work of 3 people, about watching Trent get praised in meetings for ideas he'd overheard in hallways. Ruth listened without interrupting. When I finished, she got up and went to her bedroom and came back with a fireproof lockbox, the kind that survived house fires. She set it on the table and opened it with a small brass key she wore on a chain under her shirt. Inside were documents. Originals, not copies. She laid them out in front of me one by one slowly, the way she used to lay out site plans when she was teaching me to read them. Then she told me what they meant. I sat very still. The chicken salad went untouched. Ruth folded her hands on the table and said, "Frank has been running this firm like it belongs to him. It doesn't. 52% of it belongs to you. It always has. He just doesn't know that yet." Walter Osei was 63, soft-spoken, and precise in the way of someone who had spent 40 years choosing words carefully because the wrong word cost people things they couldn't get back. His office was on West 6th in a building that smelled like paper and good coffee. He had been Ruth's personal attorney since 1994. He had drafted the family trust in 2019, updated it in 2022, and held the original will in his office safe. He walked me through everything that first meeting with a patience that I later understood was intentional. He knew I was frightened. He knew I was also angry. He wanted me to be neither, at least not yet. "The trust structure is clean," he said. The shares never left Ruth's legal possession. Frank's operational authority was always separate from equity ownership. He can run the company. He can hire and fire. He can sign contracts. But he cannot transfer shares he does not own. He slid a document toward me. "What your father announced tonight at that dinner, or may announce at some future point, regarding equity transfer to your brother, that transfer will have no legal basis if it touches Ruth's 52%. Because that 52% is yours the moment Ruth passes." I looked at the document. My name was on the second line. Walter let me sit with that for a moment. Then he said something that has stayed with me every day since. He said, "Your grandmother didn't do this because she was angry at your father, Maya. She did this because she trusted you. There is a difference. That difference is the reason you need to be patient." Ruth Callaway passed away on a Sunday morning in April, 8 weeks after Frank's dinner at Garrison's. She was 79. She had known since January that the cancer had moved into her liver and that treatment would only buy weeks at a cost she didn't want to pay. She chose her own terms, the way she had always done. She spent those weeks doing exactly what she wanted. She had her African violets repotted. She finished a novel she'd been reading for a year. She had me come out to Buddha every Sunday, and we sat on her porch, and she told me things I needed to know. Not about the will. She knew I had the folder. She told me about the firm's early years, about the clients who had tried to underpay her and the ones who had become lifelong friendships, about the city council member who'd tried to cut her out of a contract in 1991 and the very quiet way she had made sure that didn't happen. She was teaching me something I understood later. She was teaching me her method, which was patience, precision, and the absolute refusal to act from emotion when strategy was available. The funeral was on a Wednesday. Frank gave a eulogy that was mostly about himself. Trent wore a suit that still had the dry cleaning tag inside the collar. My mother cried genuinely, which I respected. I sat in the front pew and held Ruth's order of service in both hands and did not speak because nothing I could have said in that church would have been appropriate for that room. After, Walter Osei found me near the parking lot. "The estate clock starts now," he said quietly. "We have work to do." The next 6 weeks were the most disciplined of my life. Walter filed the trust documents with the probate court. The share transfer triggered automatically under the trust's terms, which meant it did not require anyone's consent or signature. It was not a gift. It was not a bequest in the traditional sense. It was a structural transfer that Ruth had engineered years in advance precisely so that it could not be interfered with, challenged on capacity grounds, or delayed by family objection. I went to work every day during those 6 weeks. I sat in my regular desk in the open plan area, the one without a window, the one next to the printer that jammed twice a week. I attended the Monday morning project meetings where Trent now sat at the head of the conference table in a chair that had a slightly higher back than the others. I listened. I said what was useful. I filed what needed filing. I did not tell anyone what was happening. Not my friend Priya, who worked in our landscape architecture department and would have been the most trustworthy person I knew. Not Karen, Frank's assistant, who had always been kind to me and who deserved better than to be put in a difficult position. I took calls from Walter in my car at lunch, windows up, parked behind the coffee shop on South Congress. The share transfer was processing. The estate was being administered cleanly. There were no complications. Walter told me each time that everything was on track. I said thank you and drove back to the office and sat down at my jammer printer desk and kept working. I was waiting for the right moment. Walter and I had discussed it. We had a plan. The moment arrived from an unexpected direction, which I should have anticipated because that was how things worked when other people were also making plans. It was Karen who told me about it, apologetically, at the coffee station on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks after Ruth's funeral. She poured her cup and then kept her back to the room and said quietly, "Your dad is planning something for the end of next month. A big investor event. Gala, he's calling it." She paused. "He's invited the Hargrove Group partners, the 2 new development contacts from Dallas, the city planning commissioner." Karen was methodical by nature, one of the most organized people I'd ever worked with, and she was telling me this in a careful, indirect way that meant she thought I should know. "He's framing it as the future of Callaway design," she said. "There will be a formal announcement of Trent's CEO transition. Transfer of shares will be announced publicly." She finally turned and looked at me. "I thought you should know the timeline." I held my coffee mug. "How many people?" she thought. 60, maybe 70. "He's booked the rooftop at the Fairmont." I nodded. "Thank you, Karen." She nodded back and walked away, and I stood at the coffee station for an extra moment. The Fairmont rooftop. 60 investors and city contacts. A formal share transfer announcement. I went to my car at lunch and called Walter. He picked up on the second ring. I told him the date. There was a short pause. Then he said, "That's our moment." "I'll be ready." "How are you?" "I'm ready too," I said. "Good," he said. "Because after this, everything changes." I spent the 2 weeks before the gala doing something that looked like nothing from the outside. I reviewed every project file I had ever touched at Callaway Design Group. I organized them, backed them up to my personal drive, and prepared a clean summary document of my contributions across 8 years. Not for ego. For record. Walter had told me that in situations like this one, the cleanest outcomes came when the person asserting their rights had impeccable documentation of their standing. I also did something harder. I made a list of the people in that firm who were good at their jobs, who treated colleagues fairly, who had been there long enough to have institutional knowledge that would matter after the dust settled. Priya was at the top of the list. So was Marcus Gould, the senior project manager who had nothing to do with Frank's dinner table politics and everything to do with keeping our construction timelines functional. I was not planning to destroy the firm. I was planning to take my rightful place in it. There was a difference, and that difference required me to think beyond the moment of revelation and toward what came after. On the Thursday before the gala, I went to Walter's office one final time. He had the certified documents ready. The original trust deed. The share transfer confirmation. A certified letter addressed to Frank Callaway and Trent Callaway, co-signed by the probate court administrator, stating clearly and without ambiguity that the 52% equity stake in Callaway Design Group, formerly held by Ruth Callaway, had transferred by operation of trust to Maya Callaway. Walter put everything in a leather document carrier. He was calm. He told me he would be at the Fairmont rooftop at 8 o'clock. He told me to let Frank make his announcement first. "Then we walk in," he said. "Timing, Maya. Just like your grandmother taught you." The gala was on a Friday evening in June. Austin in June was warm and still bright at 7 o'clock, the sky that particular pale gold that made the city look like a postcard. The Fairmont rooftop was everything Frank had wanted it to be. String lights over a terrace with downtown views, white linen high tops, servers in black moving through the crowd with champagne flutes and crab-topped crostini. I arrived at 7:15 in a dress I had bought that week, dark green, simple, well-fitted. I had chosen it carefully. I wanted to look like exactly what I was, a professional, a principal, a person with standing. Not like someone who had come to cause a scene. Trent was already there, near the bar, in a new suit, looking like someone who had practiced being relaxed. My mother stood with a group of Diane's friends from the Art League who I recognized from Christmas parties. Frank was working the room with the ease of a man in his element, the glad handing, the shoulder touching, the brief hearty laughs that meant nothing and cost nothing. I took a glass of sparkling water from a passing tray. I did not take the champagne. I wanted to be precise tonight. I recognized the Hargrove Group partners near the terrace railing, 2 men in their 50s with the careful clothes of people managing significant capital. The Dallas contacts were near them, also in conversation with Frank's business partner Dale. I counted roughly 60 people. Walter had texted me at 6:58. "I'm downstairs. Just say the word." I had not replied yet. I was waiting for Frank to start speaking. Frank called for attention at 8:15. Someone dimmed the string lights slightly and the crowd settled into a loose semicircle. I positioned myself toward the middle, visible, in clear sight lines. Frank was practiced at this. He had a warmth in public settings that he didn't always carry in private, the warmth of a man who had learned that charm was a business tool. He thanked everyone for coming. He talked about the firm's 40-year history with just enough humility to seem genuine and just enough pride to seem justified. He mentioned the Meridian Commons project by name for the first time that evening. Said it had been a transformative win for the firm. Did not say who had run it. The crowd murmured approvingly. Then he shifted into the announcement. Tonight, he said, I want to share something that represents the next chapter of Callaway Design Group. He gestured to Trent, who stepped forward with a smile that was almost convincing. Our company was built on family. It will continue to be built on family. Effective July 1st, Trent Callaway assumes the role of Chief Executive Officer. He will also receive controlling equity of 31% of company shares, making him the largest single individual shareholder of Callaway Design Group. Applause moved through the crowd. The Hargrove partners nodded at each other. Trent shook Frank's hand and then did the modest deflecting thing with his palm that telegraphed that he had rehearsed this moment in his bathroom mirror. I looked at my phone. I texted Walter one word. Now. Walter Osei walked onto the Fairmont rooftop at 8:22 carrying a leather document carrier and the quiet authority of someone who had spent 40 years being the most prepared person in any room he entered. He was wearing a dark suit. He moved without hurry. One of the event staff moved to intercept him near the entrance, and he said something brief and showed something from his breast pocket, and the staff member stepped aside. I watched this from across the terrace. My heart was steady. I had expected it to race, and it didn't. The crowd had not fully noticed Walter yet. Frank was still speaking, wrapping up his remarks, saying something about innovation and the built environment. Then Dale, who was standing near the entrance and had seen Walter come in, frowned and leaned toward Frank and said something in his ear. Frank's expression changed. Just slightly. The warmth recalibrated into something more guarded. He looked toward the entrance. He saw Walter. And then he looked at me. I met his eyes across the terrace. I did not look away. Frank tried to keep speaking. Ladies and gentlemen, I also want to take a moment to recognize. Walter had reached the center of the space now. He stopped. He addressed the room without raising his voice because he did not need to. The acoustics on the terrace were good, and his voice was the kind that carried. Excuse me, he said simply. My name is Walter Osei. I am the attorney for the estate of Ruth Eleanor Callaway. I have certified documents that are directly relevant to the equity announcement that was just made. I am required to serve these now. The rooftop went very quiet. Not the polite quiet of an audience settling. The particular silence of 60 people recalculating something at the same time. Frank stepped forward. Walter, he said, with a careful steadiness that cost him visible effort. This is not the time or place. Walter held his gaze. Mr. Callaway, I have a certified court document and I will serve it now. There is no legally appropriate way for you to prevent that. He opened the leather carrier and produced an envelope, cream-colored, with a probate court seal on the front. He handed it to Frank. Frank did not want to take it. He took it. Then Walter turned slightly and produced a second envelope, which he held out to Trent. Trent looked at his father. Frank gave a tiny, tight shake of his head. Trent took the envelope anyway, because 60 people were watching and he didn't know what else to do. Walter then straightened and addressed the room with the measured clarity of someone reading into a court record. For the benefit of those present and any parties with a financial interest in Callaway Design Group, I want to state the following. The estate of Ruth Eleanor Callaway held 52% of the founding shares of Callaway Design Group in a private family trust established in 2019. Those shares did not form part of the operational equity available to Frances Callaway. Upon Ruth Callaway's passing on April 14th of this year, those shares transferred by operation of trust to their sole designated beneficiary. He paused. Then he looked directly at me. Maya Callaway. He said my name clearly. Maya Callaway is the majority shareholder of Callaway Design Group. No one in that room moved for what felt like a very long time. I counted 3 seconds by the lights blinking on the downtown skyline behind the terrace railing. Then all of it happened at once. Frank said, "That is absolutely not," and stopped. Trent said, "What?" and stopped. One of the Hargrove partners leaned over to the other and said something I couldn't hear. Dale put his hand on Frank's arm. My mother made a sound that was not quite a word. I walked forward through the crowd, which parted the way crowds did when they sensed a center of gravity shifting. I reached Walter and stood beside him. Frank was looking at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Not anger, not yet. Something rawer than anger. Something that looked like the moment a person understood they had miscalculated everything. "Frank," I said. My voice was steady. "I want you to know that I have not done this to hurt you. I have done this because Grandma Ruth built this company, and she had every right to decide who carried it forward." He said, "She would never." "She did," I said. "For years ago she set this up. She updated it 18 months ago. She knew exactly what she was doing, and she was of sound mind, and there is no ambiguity in the document, and Walter will tell you the same." Walter nodded once, without drama. Frank looked at the envelope in his hand. He had not opened it. He was 64 years old, and in that moment he looked all of it. The investors around us had begun very quietly making phone calls. I thought that was the end of the confrontation. I had planned for the announcement, for the shock, for Frank's initial resistance. I had not fully planned for Trent. My brother had been quiet since Walter spoke my name. He had that particular stillness of someone who was not actually calm, but who had gone somewhere internal while he figured out what move was available to him. He found it. He stepped forward and addressed the Hargrove partners directly, which was smart in a way I hadn't anticipated. "Gentlemen," he said with the smile he'd practiced in mirrors, "I want to assure you that whatever administrative questions exist around our internal equity structure, my role as CEO is fully confirmed by the board, and that has nothing to do with shareholder percentages." One of the Hargrove partners, the taller one with silver hair, said mildly, "Actually, that's not quite right. A 52% shareholder has significant influence over executive appointments under most operating agreements. Do you have a copy of your operating agreement handy?" Trent's smile held for a moment longer than it should have. I reached into my bag. Walter had given me a clean copy of the operating agreement 2 weeks ago. I had read it 17 times. "I know this document," I said, and I held it up. Section 9, subsection 4. Executive appointments require ratification by shareholders holding 30% or more. As majority shareholder, I have the right to call a ratification review. The taller Hargrove partner looked at me, then at Trent, then back at me. He said, "You've done your homework." "I have," I said. "I've had 8 years of practice in this company. I know exactly how it works." Frank pulled me aside 15 minutes later. The crowd had broken into smaller conversations, the kind that happened when people needed to process something in groups before they knew how to respond individually. Frank found a quieter corner of the terrace near the stairwell door, and he looked at me with an expression I was not prepared for. He didn't look angry anymore. He looked tired. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. You planned this, he said. Not to hurt you, I said again. But yes. I've been working with Walter since February. He rubbed his face. Your grandmother never told me. I know. Why didn't you come to me directly? When, Dad? I asked him. When exactly was the right moment? When you gave Trent the VP role he hadn't earned. When you paid me $38,000 a year to run projects that kept this firm alive. When you said in front of 30 guests that I just work here. He was quiet. I kept my voice even, not because I wasn't angry, but because I had decided weeks ago that this conversation would not be the place for that anger. I don't want to destroy what you built, I told him. But I have to be honest, you didn't build it alone. Ruth built the foundation. I've been maintaining it for 8 years. And tonight you tried to give the future of it to someone who doesn't know the difference between a drainage easement and a property line. Frank's jaw tightened. Trent is capable. He's 28, Dad. Give him time and he might be. But he is not ready to be CEO, and you know that. Frank looked at the city lights. He didn't deny it. That was the most honest thing he'd done all evening. The Hargrove partners requested a meeting with me before they left. Not with Frank. Not with Trent. With me. We sat at one of the high-top tables while the gala wound down around us, servers clearing plates, guests making their exits with the slightly dazed energy of people who had witnessed something they hadn't expected. The taller partner, whose name was Richard Hale, put his business card on the table and slid it toward me. We've been working with Callaway Design Group for 3 years, he said. We've liked the work. We've had concerns about the leadership direction. I looked at the card. What kind of concerns? He glanced at his partner briefly. Execution, he said. Project delivery has been strong. Relationship management at the executive level has been, he paused, inconsistent. I suspected I knew what inconsistent meant. It meant Trent's Scottsdale golf trip had been charged to their project account. It meant a call hadn't been returned for 2 weeks in March when their development timeline was under pressure. It meant something had felt off and they hadn't been able to name why. What would you need to see from this company going forward? I asked. He looked at me for a moment, measuring. Stability, he said finally. Competent leadership. Someone who actually understands the work. I nodded. I'm meeting with Walter on Monday to begin a full review of the firm's governance structure, I said. I'd be glad to share the outcomes of that review with you directly. He picked up his champagne glass and touched it briefly to the rim of my sparkling water. I look forward to it, he said. It was Diane who surprised me most that night. My mother had stayed quiet through the entire confrontation, which was her pattern, had always been her pattern. Diane Callaway was not a cruel woman. She was a conflict-avoidant one, which in a family like ours amounted to the same damage through different means. She found me near the elevator at 9:30 as people were leaving. She was holding her clutch in both hands. She looked at me and said, "You look like her, you know. Like Ruth." I wasn't sure what to say to that. Ruth was the most formidable person I had ever known. I took it as the highest compliment anyone had ever paid me, even if my mother wasn't sure she meant it that way. She did this on purpose, didn't she? Diane said. It wasn't really a question. Yes, I said. She planned it very carefully, and she told me I needed to be patient, and she was right. My mother nodded slowly. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I should have said something at that dinner. At Garrison's. When your father said what he said. I looked at her. She was not a woman who apologized easily. She was making an effort that cost her something, and I could see that. It doesn't fix what happened, I said. I know, she said. But I want you to know I heard it. And I knew it was wrong, and I said nothing, and that was its own kind of wrong. The elevator arrived. I held the door for her. We rode down together in silence, which was more honest between us than most of our conversations had been in years. The thing I had not prepared for was Trent calling me at 11 o'clock that night. I was home, shoes off, sitting on my couch with a cup of tea and the particular exhaustion of a day that had required me to be completely controlled for hours at a stretch. His name appeared on my phone and I almost let it go to voicemail. I picked up. There was a silence on his end before he spoke. He wasn't using his easy voice. He said, "I didn't know." I let that sit for a moment. "About the trust?" "About any of it," he said. "About what you actually did at this company." "I've been looking at the Meridian file tonight." "The whole file?" He paused. "Maya, you rebuilt that entire project from scratch in 6 weeks." "I know," I said. "Why didn't you say something?" "I told people, Trent. I said exactly what I had done and what it required and what it meant for the firm's pipeline. Nobody wrote it down." His silence told me he understood what that meant. "I didn't try to take something from you," he said finally. "I know that too," I said. "You took what Dad handed you. I can't be angry at you for that. But what he handed you wasn't his to give, and neither of us can pretend that this situation was fair." Another silence. "What happens now?" "That's partly up to you," I said. "The CEO role needs to be earned, Trent. I'm not going to tell you it's impossible. I'm telling you it's not where you are right now. But if you want to actually learn this business, I mean really learn it, I'm willing to work with that." He was quiet for so long I thought the call had dropped. Then he said, "Okay." The governance review took 6 weeks. Walter handled the legal structure. I handled the operational side. I went through every contract, every project account, every vendor relationship. What I found confirmed what I had suspected and added several things I hadn't known. The firm's billing rates had been undercutting the market by 12% for 4 years, a decision Frank had made to compete on price rather than quality. 2 key project managers had left in the past 18 months because their compensation hadn't kept pace with their responsibilities. The Scottsdale trip had in fact been charged to the Hargrove account incorrectly. I documented everything without editorializing. I prepared a report that was clear, factual, and fair. Then I called a shareholder meeting, which as majority owner I had the right to do, and I presented the report to Frank, Trent, Dale, and 2 outside board members that Walter had recommended we add for governance balance. Frank sat through the presentation with his arms folded. He did not interrupt. When I finished, he said, "So, what do you want?" "I want this firm to function the way Ruth built it to function," I said. "With rigor. With fair compensation for the people who actually do the work. With leadership that understands the product." He looked at the table. "What does that mean for me?" "You built real relationships in this industry," I said. "That has value. I want you to move into a senior advisory role. Client relationships, business development, your strengths. I'm not asking you to leave." He looked at me for a long time. Then he looked at the report in his hands. The numbers didn't lie. They never did. Frank accepted the advisory role on a Wednesday afternoon in August. He didn't do it with grace, exactly. He did it with the complicated resignation of a man who understood the ground had shifted permanently and that fighting it would cost him more than conceding. He asked me one question before he signed the restructured operating agreement. "Did Ruth tell you everything? About the early years?" "Some of it," I said. "She told me about the garage on Runberg Lane. About the park contracts. About the council member in 1991. He almost smiled. "Gerald Prater," he said. "She never forgave him." He looked out the window of the conference room at the Austin skyline. "I was there in that garage," he said quietly. "I was 16. I used to answer the phone for her after school." "I know," I said. "She told me." He looked at me. She talked about those years? All the time, I said. He nodded. His expression shifted into something I had no name for, something between grief and recognition. Maybe he was understanding for the first time that Ruth had talked to me the way she had because she was passing something on. That the Sundays in Buddha and the site plan lessons and the patient teaching had been intentional, had been preparation, had been love expressed as legacy. I didn't say any of this to him. I let him sit with it. Then I slid the agreement across the table and handed him a pen. He signed it. His hand was steady. I respected that. Whatever Frank Calloway was and wasn't, he had never been a coward, and in that moment he proved it. 3 months after the Fairmont Gala, I sat at the head of the conference table at Calloway Design Group for my first Monday morning meeting as principal owner and managing director. The table was the same one. The room was the same room. The light through the east-facing windows was the same pale gold I had watched every Monday for 8 years from a chair near the middle. Priya was there, now officially Director of Landscape Architecture, a title I had given her because it reflected the job she had already been doing without the recognition. Marcus Gould was there, Project Management Lead. Karen was there, now Chief of Operations, a role she had been performing informally since before I arrived. Trent was there too, in a junior project coordinator seat, which was where he needed to be. He had accepted it without complaint, which told me something had genuinely shifted in him. Frank was not at the table. He was in Dallas that week on a client relationship call, which was exactly what his advisory role was designed to produce. I opened the meeting the way Ruth had told me she used to open the first Monday of every month in that converted garage on Runberg Lane. She said she would look around at whoever was in the room, and she would say simply, "What are we building this week?" So I looked around my table. At Priya, at Marcus, at Karen, at my brother still finding his footing, at the 6 other people who showed up every day and did real work for a firm they believed in. "What are we building this week?" I asked. And we got to work. If someone who was supposed to protect you once chose their own comfort over your future, tell me about it in the comments. And if you've ever had to be patient when everything in you wanted to speak, you already know exactly how this felt.